Thank you. No, I don't use comics, and I always laugh and say that I'm much more of a verbal person and not a visual person, right? So I can't draw, and I'm not one of those people that doodles or thinks with drawing. So a lot of words, even in my presentations, you'll notice I have way more words than Mark has, because that's how I think, and it's okay. And it's okay that we're different. So I wanted to talk about creativity and when not to be creative and when to be creative. As an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist, my interest is directly related to creativity in the workplace. And as a creativity researcher, I will say that we don't always want or need creativity. I'll start with that. I do want to set the stage talking about some of the myths associated with creativity. One of them, obviously, is that creativity is always good and always beneficial. So let me actually start by setting the stage. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but mention why creativity is so important. We have complex problems, as was mentioned. We have rapid changes in technology. The previous talk about ChatGPT is just one example. I could tell you that all my academic friends are going, how can we assess students now that ChatGPT can write reasonable essays? So we have to revise how we're thinking about student assessment, for example. We have customer expectations. You can see this when the new iPhone comes out and it doesn't have quite enough innovations and creative functions from the one before it. Consumers are upset. They're expecting creativity and innovation. And in the end, it provides organizations, when done correctly, with a competitive advantage that allows them to stay functional in today's society. So creativity is important. It's also important for specific workers. We're finding that a lot of work that is more routine has been automated, whether it's by robots or AI. AI is still sort of clunky. We're seeing it with ChatGPT, but it won't take long for AI to replace a lot of the more routine white-collar tasks. The World Economic Forum puts together a list every so often of top skills that are needed by employees. This was presented as the top skills needed in 2025, so in 2 years. Of the top 10, 5 of these are directly related to creativity: analytical thinking and innovation, complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity and originality, reasoning, problem solving, and ideation. So the others actually have to do with collaboration and teamwork, many of them. So you put the two together and you can see why this particular symposium is really, really needed. So, okay, creativity is important, but I want to talk a little bit about some myths that we have, because that make it more difficult both for organizations to implement different interventions or think about how to have a creative workforce. It stands in the way of people believing that they could be creative and so on. So first of all, I get a lot of times when I talk to people about creativity and they say, oh, we can't define creativity. We kind of know it when we see it, but it's kind of squishy and we can't define it. I'll get to that in a little bit, but we've been defining creativity, at least as researchers, and you could argue whether a definition is appropriate or not, but we've been defining it for at least 30 years and quite consistently. I also hear, oh, creativity is only relevant to arts and science, right? So we had Mark talking about comics, but obviously you could see that we could take a lot from the comics and use it in our own work, whether it's the principles that he's talking about or thinking about how we could draw and learn from our own drawings about the project or problems that we're trying to solve. The reality is that you can be creative in all kinds of ways. You can solve, as long as you have a problem to solve, you can come up with a creative solution. as I mentioned, one of the myths is that, we need to be a creative organization. Creativity is always needed. That's not necessarily the case. I'll talk about why that is. And that creativity is always a good thing or positive. And then the last one, that more ideas is equals to what we call creativity. And I will tell you that I could probably speak about any of these for at least an hour, and I only have about 15 more minutes, so it's going to be very brief. Yeah, anyway, so this is the stuff I get excited about. So in terms of definition, because that really sets the stage for everything, we've been defining creativity as an idea, a solution, a product, or even a process that we implement in an organization that is both original, meaning novel, and useful, or appropriate, or solves the problem. Now, we apply this to everyday problems. We apply this to issues in organizations. When we judge art, the definition varies slightly, but that's not what I'm talking about. But if you're thinking about creativity in an organization, we really need both to exist to have a creative solution to a problem. If we have an original solution, but it's not useful, it can't be implemented. And I'll give you an example. One of the problems that I use when I study creativity, when I work with my students, the perennial, there's no parking on campus, right? How do you solve that problem? One student a few years ago said, we should build parking structures on the moon. Very creative, very original. Not particularly useful. I don't know how we implement it. I don't know how we do this. I don't think we have the technology, but so it really doesn't solve the parking problem. If we have a useful solution, but it's not original, it's something that we've done over and over again, it's a routine solution. It might be perfectly fine. It's just not creative. So we need both components of originality and usefulness for creativity to exist. I mentioned creativity is lots of ideas. This really comes from this whole notion of ideation or brainstorming that started in the 50s and continues until this day. You'll see this as, people say, oh, I have this test, uses for a brick, generate as many ideas as you can. And the problem is that more ideas are not necessarily more creative ideas. I could come up with lots of uses for a brick, build a house, build a shed, build a school, build a hospital, build a factory, and I could continue for as many builds as you want. None of them will be creative because they're not really original. So more ideas are not necessarily more creative ideas, but if you're thinking about implementing those ideas, it takes a time to review them and decide which ones are good ideas to be implemented, which should we use, and the more ideas you have, it actually takes more time reviewing. And what we're also finding out is that people are not always good at choosing the creative ideas. So if you have more ideas, the likelihood of you choosing a bad idea, meaning one that is not creative or doesn't even solve the problem, increases. And in our own research, we find that people, depending on the study, sometimes the choice of a poor idea, meaning one that's not creative or useful, ranges from anywhere between 40% of our sample to 25% of our sample. So not encouraging. Part of what makes creativity not always the best case is that in order for creativity to occur, we have to have the right conditions. Creativity is effortful. It takes time to think about an idea that is creative. We tend to rely on our routine ideas. Creativity is intentional. We need time and space to think about it. As I said, it's time consuming, it requires resources. And because the ideas are new, it's risky, right? Mark talked about the risk of creating a TV show or a film, low risk with comics, but still there's a risk. If you devote time and effort into something, if you put money into something and it doesn't work out, you lost time, money, and effort that could have been put to another use. So you have to think carefully about when you want creative ideas. So again, and creative ideas, because they're new, can fail. We see this. We see this in organizations all the time. So, routine solutions, if you have a solution that is useful, meaning it solves the problem and it's routine and it works, great. I will tell you, as a creativity researcher, maybe you don't need creativity. So when is creativity needed? Have we tried solutions and they didn't work? If they didn't, that's potentially a solution could be looking for a creative idea, because the routine ideas don't work. You can start by thinking about what didn't work and taking the pieces that worked and start to build a new solution using the parts that worked, discarding the parts that didn't. The other piece is, why do you want a creative idea? So sometimes you want a creative idea because you want market share. Sometimes you want a creative idea because that's how you get attention. And that's fine. But have a purpose, have a reason for the creative idea. Don't assume that creativity is always good, because again, you're devoting time and resources and effort to something that may or may not work. Switching gears a little bit, this is something that I've been studying for the last 10 years or so, is the use of creativity for intentional damage to people, organizations, or objects. You see this in crime, you see this in terrorism, you see this in smaller scales with what we call counterproductive work behavior. So coming up with a really creative excuse of why you can't do work or can't go into work. What really got me thinking about this is 9/11. And as much as I hate to say this, the use of airplanes as missiles was very creative. And you could see the novelty by the fact that it happened 3 times, and then the 4th plane basically was downed in a field in Pennsylvania and never made it to its target, because at that point it was no longer novel. The passengers on the plane knew what was going on and were able to stop it. If you think about crime and terrorism, it is a lot harder to stop creative crimes and creative terrorism. So if embezzlement is being done in a creative way, as an organization, we have a harder time finding it, and we have a harder time stopping it. Understanding malevolent creativity and understanding that creativity can be used for negative purposes, I think, is really important. Creativity is not all sunshine and roses. It's not all good. We also sometimes have unintentional consequences of what we try to do with positive aspects, and then we find some negative uses for them. The idea was developed with a positive purpose, but people found a way to use it negatively. I want to leave you, though, with a slightly more positive outlook about improving creativity in organizations. I know these points are a little vague. I think all of the conversations that are happening over these 3 days should give you a sense of what should go in these boxes. What are the right conditions for creativity? What is the right team? Who are these people? How do you create the team correctly, put together a group of people that can work well together? How do you train and develop individuals and leaders so they can be creative? And this piece that I've just mentioned, which is knowing when a creative solution or a product is needed and knowing when it is not. and going after creativity only when it's appropriate. So I want to leave you with my contact information. I'm always happy to chat about creativity. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Fabulous, Roni. Thank you so much. Does anybody have a question for Roni in the chat, or go ahead and unmute and holler?
Roni, I have a question. You
Sure.
you talked about when not to be creative, when you have a routine solution that will do.
Mhm.
On the other end of it, if you decide that you do need to engage in a creative solution, can you overdo it? And how do you know if you're overdoing it? Is there a concept of adequate creativity?
That's a great question. So again, I go back to the definition, right? So if it's creative, it has to be novel and useful. And potentially it could be too novel, right? So we can't see the usefulness of it.
Mm.
But at that point, we probably moved away from creativity a little bit, right? Because usefulness is part of that definition. But yeah, I think people can be too novel and come up with really strange ideas because they think that's what creativity is.
Right. Okay. So I like what I think I heard you say, where if you're going to engage in that, don't let the novel side overshadow the usefulness of it.
Correct.
Obscure the usefulness of it.
Yeah.
That's a good test.
Well, it's interesting because it relates a little bit to what CJ asked in the chat. He says, what about routine solutions that become novel? Are they creative, i.e. use a brick in a new way? So talking about that functional fixedness that we looked at a little bit last night, is that creativity?
Mhm.
And also, frankly, the original study, creative alternative uses for Frisbee. Would they be creative if they weren't useful?
Yeah, and you know, that's part of the problem. I'm not crazy about that particular measure. For a number of reasons. One of them is because it really focuses on ideation. When you look at creative process models and how we think, there's stuff that happens before we generate ideas, and there's stuff that happens after we generate ideas in terms of our thinking. And this particular prompt or approach ignores those. And I think that's problematic. But the second one is that really this is not how we think in real life, right? Usually we have a problem that we try to find a solution for. Here, what we're doing is we're saying, oh, here are all these solutions. Let's go find a problem. And that's not quite it, right? So I think the alternate uses task has we can learn something from it, but it doesn't really reflect how we think in real life. Now, the other part of the question is what constitutes creativity? And there's a big discussion about whether, you know, if you take, for example, a process that's been implemented in another organization and use it for your own organization, is that creative? It's already created, you didn't think about it, but it was never used in your organization. So for the people in your organization, it is creative. I'm not quite sure what to do with that in terms, you know, it sort of, to me, falls in the middle. I don't want to discount it. I think there's a lot of usefulness of doing stuff like that, borrowing from other disciplines, from other organizations, other domains, and putting the things in different places. But it's not as creative as coming up with something completely new.